Hello, welcome to the second lesson on Be Taught Sport, continuing with anatomy. This time we're on lesson 2, the skeletal system. Now, if you were with us last time, you would have seen in lesson 1 we did major bones of the body. We looked at postural deviations, including kyphosis and scoliosis. We looked at the axial and appendicular skeleton, and then finished on types of bones. If you're comfortable with that, then great, move on to this second lesson, or even if you already knew that stuff and wanted to move on to the second lesson, that's absolutely fine. As always, you will need a pen and paper and even a highlighter to get you through this lesson. Now, on this video today, we're going to be looking at bone growth, functions of the skeletal system, and then looking at the functions of the types of bones when performing sporting techniques and actions which will be needed for your exam. And as always, there'll be a few questions at the end of this video to help you with your exam as well. Now, starting with bone growth. Now, this is one of the more complicated topics that you'll go through on the skeletal system, so I'll try and go through it bit by bit. It's not a lot of detail that you actually need. Now, some of the lessons that you'll go through for A-level PE or for sports science, you'll need to go into ossification in a lot more detail. Now, with BTEC Sport, not as much detail is required, so I'll go through what is required. Now, firstly, ossification is actually the process of bones forming. So if you look at the picture on the bottom right hand side, believe it or not, all of our bones when we're born actually start as cartilage. So the key thing you need to know is when bones grow, that process is called ossification. Now obviously through infancy and adulthood our bones increase in size, and depending on obviously how big your bones grow normally depend on what kind of sport you'll do. So obviously the people that are a lot taller, 6 foot plus, might do basketball, or stereotypically the people that are a lot shorter might even do things such as be a jockey. Now, what happens is the ends of each long bone, there are two things called epiphyseal plates, which allow for the bones to grow longer as well, but we'll go through that in a bit more detail. Now, what I want you to go through here is a process of the pictures at the bottom right. It is in 4 stages. Now, the first stage is that all bones start as cartilage, as I mentioned to you before. Now, we're talking not just specifically the long bone, we are talking about all the bones here. Now, with long bones, you'll see with the pictures on the right-hand side, there's a bit extra on the top there, which is the bone marrow. Now, this is where the epiphyseal plate is created, but we'll go into that into a bit more detail later. So firstly, ossification, what is the process? So firstly, obviously all bones start as cartilage. Then what happens is calcium and phosphate gather together on the cartilage, and what they do is they trap it and cause the cells of the cartilage to die. Now as soon as that happens, tiny spaces are left when the cartilage dies, and then that then fills with blood vessels and they grow inside that. Now obviously the key thing with blood vessels is it can then deliver key blood cells to that particular bone. Now there are 2 things that are then delivered to the bone, and they are called osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and we'll go through that in detail in a second. Now, the first thing about osteoblasts is they actually deliver the key nutrients that are there to develop the bone. And what happens is the bone then continues to develop until it's fully formed. And the key thing here is, as you can see in the pictures on the right hand side, the bone isn't fully formed until the last picture. As you can see in the third picture there, the top of the part, which is the epiphyses, it still needs to be grown before it then turns into a full grown bone, and we'll go through that into a bit more detail. But the key thing is you need to remember is the process is called ossification. The first part of the bone always starts as cartilage. What then happens is basically calcium and phosphate act together, trapping the cartilage and making the cartilage cells die. What then happens is tiny spaces appear on the cartilage, and blood vessels start to then grow in these spaces and transport osteoblasts and nutrients to then develop the bone. The bone continues then to develop until fully formed. Ossification also happens at the end of each long bone, which is a diaphyses, where bone marrow is then formed and red blood cells are created. Now what you'll find is actually there is not bone marrow in every single type of bone. So when we look at short bone or, for example, a regular bone, that doesn't occur there. It does in the long bone, and this is why there's extra blood vessels there at the end, as you can see in that image. And then once a long bone is formed, the head fuses with the main shaft, so again the diaphyses, to create the epiphyseal line. Now what happens is at the epiphyseal plate, this is basically where the bone grows in the long bone. As soon as the bone is fully developed, what will then happen is basically the bone needs to stop growing and the epiphyseal line will be created, which is basically where the bone used to grow. Now, continuing with bone growth, I've obviously mentioned osteoclast and osteoblast, which I'll go into a bit more detail. But the key thing about obviously bones, it is a living organ, and it does need to be constantly reshaped through a process called remodeling. So there's two different things there. Ossification is the process when bones are actually created, where remodeling is the process when they're reshaped or reformed. So imagine, for example, tarmac. Now, if you constantly, when it first gets produced, it's great, it's very strong. However, once it's then been made and loads of cars go over it, they don't just leave it and they just let it to break down and die. What happens is they keep remodeling it or they keep relaying it, and that's exactly the same as what happens with bones. So don't get mixed up. Ossification is the process when bones are first formed, which was the last slide from the cartilage. Remodeling is the process that basically is when it's reused or reshaped or reformed. Now, the reason why all your parents always ask you to drink calcium is because calcium is one of the key minerals that is needed for bone growth, and bone mass is also maintained through that. Now, this is done through two key cells. Now, the first one is called osteoclasts. Now, what I've put in brackets there is C for clear. Now, what osteoclasts do, they are cells that remove unnecessary calcium layers whilst other layers of bone tissue are being created. So again, imagine this road being relayed, as I mentioned earlier. The osteoclasts are the one that clear the debris off the road or clear any broken parts, while someone behind would then build the new road. And it's exactly the same with the bones. Osteoclasts clear the unnecessary calcium layers, and they also absorb bone tissue during growth and repair. Now, obviously, if someone's clearing the bone, we need someone obviously to then go and make the bone. And osteoblasts, and again I've put in brackets there B for build, are cells that bring calcium to your bones and are responsible for creating the bone matter. Osteoblast activity increases when you exercise. So you can imagine, obviously, when you do a lot of exercises, your bones obviously might need to remove unnecessary calcium layers, which is what the osteoclasts do. So what then happens is the osteoblasts have to work harder to then obviously relay your bone. So what happens every time you do some exercise, your bones become stronger the more exercise you do, and that's why health experts say it's always really good for you to do a lot of exercise because it makes your bones a lot stronger. And because your osteoblast activity increases, obviously then the need for calcium increases, which obviously means that you need more calcium in your diet, and that is why it is key to have key calcium. Now, the risk of osteoporosis is then reduced. Now, for those of you who don't know what osteoporosis is, osteoporosis is a disease where the density and the strength of the bone is decreased. Now, if you can imagine your body is not doing any exercise at all, your osteoblasts and osteoclasts aren't working as hard as if you were. So then what happens is your bone actually lose the density and the strength of the bone is actually decreased massively, which means fractures then a lot more likely. And that's why you see a lot of elderly people that don't do exercise, they then get fractures. So if they fell over, it'd be very easy for them to fracture a hip or fracture a wrist, etc. Whereas if me or you fell over, we'd probably just be bruised. And that's the key thing due to the osteoclast and osteoblast working a lot more when you do exercise. Now on the left hand side there's a bit of a diagram there of how it works. So there you've got your bone at the top. What happens is your osteoclasts then break down that old bone, so it might be damaged bone, it might even be bone that just needs to be replaced, and then the osteoblasts, so B for building, would then actually build that new bone on top, making your bone more dense. And obviously once your activity increases, the calcium needs to be increases, which means the osteoclast and osteoblast will be working a lot harder. So that is why activity is so important. So ossification again is the process of new bone that is grown, so from birth, whereas the key remodeling process, the osteoblast and osteoclast, is then when basically your bone is formed and they need to reproduce it. Now, to what we looked at in the first lesson, we now need to look at the functions of the skeletal system. Now, I'm going to fly through this because this is stuff that you should know from your level 2 GCSE or BTEC sport that you've done in school. But what you then need to do is actually be able to link the functions to a sport and exercise. And I'll give you an example in a second. But I'm just going to fly through these. So some of the key functions that you should know off the top of your head. So support and protection. Your bones give you shape and provide a support framework for the whole body. Sorry, that should say for, not foe. They also provide protection to key organs. And again, you should know this. So let's try not use skull. We now need to try and use the correct skeletal terms. So cranium, which would be your brain, your thorax, which is basically your rib cage, your diaphragm, etc., etc. That is your heart, and that protects your heart and lungs, and your vertebrae obviously protect your spinal cord. Another function is leverage and attachment. All muscles are attached to our bones through tendons. Don't forget, muscle to bone is tendons, bone to bone is ligaments. Our bones provide a lever system so our muscles can pull and create movement. Muscles pull onto bones create movement, which is determined by the joint. And as we know, the length of our bones may affect the sport we may play. And then the other one is weight bearing. Your bones are very strong, and we've just looked at that due to the remodeling process, so osteoclast and osteoblast. During sport, large forces are applied to your body, and your skeletal system provides the structural strength to prevent injury. And then the last three, again, you should know these ones. Store of minerals. The bone matrix stores key vitamins and minerals, specifically the long bone, but calcium, which is used for ossification and remodeling, is stored in your bone. If we don't have enough phosphorus, which is stored in the bone, can cause muscle fatigue and joint ache, joint pain. And bone marrow stores iron, which is essential for the production of red blood cells. And bone marrow is found in the epiphyses of the long bone, which was in the image at the start of the video. Source of red blood cell production. These are produced in the long bone again. These are vital cells, as you know, they carry oxygen to the working muscles, and also white blood cells, and we definitely need these at the moment, and that's what helps fight against antibodies. So if we get flu, if we get a cold, if we get a disease, etc. And specifically at the minute, that's why they're trying to create a vaccine for the coronavirus, because what it does, it basically puts a tiny bit of coronavirus into your body, and then the white blood cells can actually fight against that antibody and basically work up an immune to that disease, and that's what they're trying to do, obviously, as we speak. And then the last one is it reduces frictions at the joints. So synovial fluid in our joints prevent bones from rubbing together and stiffening, and this obviously reduces friction between the bones, and that comes into, for example, a synovial joint, which we'll be looking at in the next video. So there are 6 different functions of the skeletal system in total. You'll need to know what they are, and you'll also need to give a basic description of what each one means. Now, the other thing you'll need to know is the different types of bones that we looked at in the last video, but also their functions of the type of bone, but also then give example. And what you have to do then is link this to a sporting example. We did this in the last video, so I won't go through this in too much detail, but there are the 5 different types of bones, and you should know by now that the long bone produces movement, support, red blood cell production. Short bone is small movement, shock absorb, stability and weight bearing. Flat bone is attachment for muscles. Irregular, which is obviously our vertebrae, is protection for our spinal cord and movement. And our sesamoid, which is our patella, is protection of the knee joint, but also reduction of friction across the joint as well. And again, if I said to you, you need to name 3 long bones or 2 short bones, you should be able to do that quite comfortably. And if you don't remember this, you need to go back to video number 1 where we looked at this. Now, from there's a very good chance they might ask you specifically to look at an image like the one I've given here. This is my women's football team, Tottenham women, so I thought I'd use this one as a good example. So firstly, I've put 3 different arrows there. So the first thing you'll need to do is basically identify the bone and the bone type, and then you'll need to state specifically what that bone is doing in this action to support the movement or the protection or something like that. So the first one is the patella. You can see that I have tried to put that underneath. I think it might be a bit lower. So the patella, as you know, is a sesamoid bone. What I've done there is I've put sesamoid bone and patella and brachii, so the examiner knows I know exactly what I'm talking about. Now there are loads in this image that I could have put. I could obviously looked at the cranium, and I could have put a skull, and I could have said this could be used to protect her when she's heading the ball. I could have put a humerus, which is a long bone in the arm, and said this is used for movement, so her arm can go across her body for movement when striking the ball. So there are lots and lots that you can do. But what you'll need to do is, once you get confident in knowing what type of the bone is, what the bone is, but also what their function is, you then will need to link it to a sporting example like I have done here. Now, what I'm going to do is, again, as I did in the last video, I've got some example exam questions for you that have come from the revision book of BTEC. Now, there are 3 in total, and what I'd like you to do is pause this video now and try and set your clock for around 10 minutes, and then make sure you write the questions. There's only 3 in total, and the total marks is 14, and you can use the image on the screen. And what you do, pause the video now, and then I will give you the answers once you come back. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you had a good chance to have a look at these example questions. Now I'm going to go through in each and every one individually. Now the first one should have been very, very straightforward. Can you name 4 different functions of a skeletal system? You could have named any of them. Now that would be one of the easier questions in the exam. It would probably come right at the start. What they might do is say movement, support and leverage are just 3 functions. Can you explain why they are one of the vital ones, or something like that? So they won't always ask you just to identify. Sometimes they will actually ask you to describe it as well. So you need to make sure you revise that. So give yourself a mark for each. There are 4 in total. Hopefully you got all 4, because that was quite an easy one. Now the second one was quite difficult, and again this is all about the process of remodelling. So Carl broke his arm playing rugby. Explain the role of Carl's bone cells during recovery. And again, there are 4 marks up for this. Now, the first thing you need to mention is obviously what type of process is going to occur. Now, it's not going to be ossification, because obviously this is going to be, that wouldn't be at birth. So what we're going to look at here is the remodelling process. So I started my paragraph by saying, in order for Carl's broken arm to heal, he will need the remodelling process to occur. So straight away, there's 1 mark. This will happen through osteoclast and osteoblasts. Okay, so again, there's another mark. Osteoclast will break down the damaged bone and reabsorb the bone tissue. There's another mark. This would reduce the bone's density, reducing the bone's strength. However, the osteoblast, and don't forget B for building, maintain bone mass by increasing bone matrix, meaning Carl's arm would repair. So as much as the process sounds quite difficult when we watch the video back, when you answer a question, it's very straightforward. You need to basically name the process, ossification, remodeling, etc. You need to name the role of osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and basically what their role is and how it is then going to recover. And I always like to actually put it back to the question. So as you see, I finished by saying this means that Carl's arm would repair. So it links back to the sporting question. Now, the last question I asked you was, using the image, can you identify 3 bones and bone types given the key functions during the tackle? Now, there are 6 marks up for grabs, and you are looking at the player diving. I put driving. I should have said, oh, it is driving, I guess. So here we are, the guy with the rugby ball, driving with the ball. Now, you could have picked loads of answers here. You could have picked anything, any bone in the whole of the body, as long as it linked. So the first thing I've done is straight away, I went to his rib cage. Now, so I've identified that the rib cage is a flat bone, and I've said here it protects the internal organ when the player gets tackled. So I get 1 mark for identifying basically the rib cage and the flat bone, and then I get 1 mark for identifying how that function will help him in this sport. Another one, flat bone, which is a scapula, and this allows for muscle attachment in order for the player to extend their arm and move through the tackle. So again, I get 1 mark for recognising the bone, flat bone, which is scapula, and then I get 1 mark for recognising basically what function is happening at that time. And finally, I've then put arrow, or I could have put arrow to his back, and I've said this is the irregular bone, which obviously in his vertebrae. This allows for movement so the player could dance his way through a tackle. I could have also said this could allow for protection for his spinal cord. You could have mentioned loads in this, so let me give you some examples. So you could have done tibia or fibula, you could have done the femur, you could have done humerus, ulnar radius, you could have done the phalanges in the hand to grip the ball. There's loads and loads you could have done. So all I need you to make sure is, once you've got the correct bone and bone type, did you then get the correct definition / function of what's happening in that sporting image? If you're not too sure and you'd like to ask me, put it in the comments below and I'll make sure I can get back to you to say if that was correct. So there were 6 marks up for grabs for that one. So there we are. So that was the second lesson on anatomy, looking at bone growth, ossification, osteoblast, osteoclast, and then also a bit on movement and how we can link that to sporting examples. Give it a like, give it a thumbs up. If you wasn't too sure, re-watch it again, look back at your notes and have another go at the different exam questions. In the next video, we'll probably be looking at joints and movement of joints as well. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon.